Hi, welcome back. In this particular video lecture, we're going to talk about arguments. Um, and when we say arguments, we're not talking about fights. Arguments here refer to the everyday arguments. When two people communicate, and especially with an intention to change somebody else's, the other person's views about something, you call that an argument. So the advertisements makes arguments. A lawyer makes arguments. Arguments are a form of reasoning within a very specific context, and we'll talk about what it is in a second. So the outline, this is the outline for the this video lecture. We'll talk about what arguments are first, talking about the components of it. Then we'll talk about how to evaluate the strength of an argument or analyze the strength of an argument. Then we'll talk about 21 common fallacies, and we try to distinguish between opinion, reason, judgment, and a fact. We'll talk about how people change their beliefs. Okay, so what is an argument? Okay. Usually we refer to these arguments that we're going to talk about in this video as informal arguments, arguments that you often hear in everyday context, like when you turn on the news, when you see an advertisement, when you talk to someone about some political issues or things of that sort. So what is an argument in that sense then, an informal argument? And usually formal argument term is used for deductive and inductive reasonings that are discussed earlier. Now, if you think about it, these arguments that we discuss about now, the argument has similar structure and a process, but the context makes it very difficult to clearly tie it to the inductive or the deductive type. And there is actually some sort of debate in the field to call these arguments logical, or they fall into a um, uh, totally different frame of reasoning. So let's begin. So what is an argument? Let's say I say that death penalty should be abolished. Okay? So this is the conclusion I'm making and supporting it with some reasons. I say because death penalty is inhumane. So I'm providing a reason to support a conclusion I'm making, or to support the claim I'm making. So here too, you'll have reasons called premises, and the conclusion is usually called the claim. So in fact, argumentation is referred to as reason giving. It's providing reasons to the claims you're making about thing for a purpose of changing somebody's opinion or substantiating your own opinion about something. So an argument is a set of premises or reasons that support a conclusion, the conclusion meaning the claim, right? And it requires at least one premise and the one conclusion. That's the bare minimum. But you may have more premises and a conclusion. You can have more conclusions and from one premise, and there's a combination of possible things depending on how complex of an argument you're making. And you can have sub-arguments building up to make a bigger argument. Um, at any level, though, right? Um, the let's say a bigger argument would be supported by smaller arguments themselves as premises. So that kind of unfolds throughout the argument structure. The idea is the conclusion you're drawing, and meaning the claim you're making and the reasons you're providing, and multiple such arguments can towards build to make a bigger argument, and all these will turn into premises for this bigger argument. This bigger argument would be called a main point, right? So uh, and we'll talk about the examples I just gave you. We'll talk more about this, but remember, the preferences, description of the events, questions are not arguments. You can question the validity of it and kind of talk about your opinion about preferences, your opinion about events and questions. And so it's not. Um, so I want you to think about factual items are not arguments, and we'll come back towards the end to talk about make some distinction between opinions, reasoned opinions, and whatnot. Okay, so some key terms that you need to know when talking about arguments. Of course, the premises, which are the reasons provided. So sometimes they're referred as the why of the argument. Okay, conclusion is the what part of the argument, right? It is you're making a claim. I prefer the word claim more than conclusion. So you make a claim and you support it with the reasons, right? These reasons are the why part, and the claim you're making is the what part, right? Now there are additional components that you will see in arguments, like assumptions here. Well, while some argue that assumptions are inevitable and others say that they're not required, nevertheless, assumptions are some unstated premises, and these unstated premises have no need for additional support. They are believed to be generally true, either at the ethical, reasonableness, or societal, cultural level. These are assumed to be commonly agreed upon standards. So, so for instance, in the last example, I said that death penalty should be abolished, and the reason I provided was that death penalty because it is uh, inhumane. By saying this, you're making an assumption or using an assumption that all inhuman things should be abolished. Okay? Okay, so that's usually these assumptions are not explicitly stated unless it is a very complex issue and you are to facilitate listeners' comprehension or making them explicit. Otherwise, it is the listener's task to figure it out. Now, there is another structure in arguments called a qualifier. Qualifier kind of it restricts the instances so that the claim someone is making here are only applicable within that situation. So claims constrain, qualifiers constrain the conclusions. Okay. And usually when you're making an argument, right, you then comes a counter argument. Counter arguments are the reasons or the arguments against your own conclusion that you're trying to. So usually when you are making an argument, you of course make your claim and provide enough support, but you also take into account um, the counter arguments to your own argument and your own conclusion and try to address those in one way or the other way. Okay. So a good argument has or will incorporate not only a conclusion and reasons, but also specifies under what circumstances this conclusion is not applicable, or is it applicable by using appropriate qualifiers. Um, then it also specifies and addresses alternative explanations for your conclusion or the counter arguments for your conclusions, and then addressing those as well. Okay, so here is an example of an argument, and you can look at this, and there's an explanation for this in the book. I want you to refer to that because I want to finish this in a shorter period of time. So now, coming to the structure of the argument, the different types of arguments depending on how you build the argument, how you're providing the support to the conclusion you're drawing. One is called convergent argument, where you are trying to, or convergent reasoning, where you're trying to provide multiple premises to support the same conclusion. For instance, you can say, you can't trust Harry. That's the claim. Or the conclusion, you're saying Harry wears jeggings, Harry demonstrates poor judgment. So you're providing all potential reasons as to why you think that you can't trust Harry. So they are equal, and they're converging to support the claim. Chained is where the conclusion, chained argument is, or chained reasoning is an argument uh, where one premise will support another sub premise, and in turn will support a, a conclusion. So that if there is any one particular um, premise that, or the reason that is weak, then the conclusion's support gets weakened. Just like losing one connection in a chain will break the chain. Okay. Um, so weakest leak. I'm so sorry. Weakest link matters when you are making a chained reasoning. Uh, for the convergent reasoning, it is you are providing multiple reasons to support. Even if one is weaker, it still supports it as an additional support in addition to other things. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Uh, Now, as I said, you can also have multiple claims or the conclusions that are supported by, or the same premise can support two different uh, uh, conclusions. And it depends on how you build up that argument. Such reasoning is called divergent reasoning. Okay, now we'll go ahead and talk about how to analyze the strength of an argument, right? Okay, how do you analyze the strength of an argument? Now, in addition to using a knowledge about different structures of the arguments, whether it's divergent, convergent, chained, and all that, you have to, at a basic level, understand that you have reasons and conclusions, reasons meaning premises, right? The first thing you need to know is, are the reasons that are provided to support the conclusion, are they acceptable? Meaning, are they true? Are they credible? And are they consistent across different contexts? Once you determine that these are acceptable premises, then you try to see, do these premises both individually and together adequately support the conclusion? Okay. Then you also take into account whether the bigger argument that is made is it addressing the counter arguments or not. A good argument would always provide counter arguments to their own argument, the conclusion, and also address those either by using qualifiers or by using different rhetoric methods to address them. Okay, so just these are the steps, especially if you're writing a bigger argument like a paper. Writing paper for what can be is an argument, making argument at a larger level. Now, first thing to do is identify premises, conclusion, assumptions, and qualifiers in the argument. Then you evaluate whether or you can be reading a bigger paper and trying to evaluate the strength of it, or you may be producing your own. Either way, the first things to identify um, are the premises, conclusion, assumptions, and qualifiers, the individual parts of the argument at a smaller and a bigger level. Then evaluate the acceptability of premises and whether premises are consistent across contexts. Then the good thing to do is to draw a diagram and try to figure out whether the argument is strong or weak. Usually, the way we think of argument is like a stool, right? It has this structure on four different legs or multiple different legs. So these legs of the table are the premises or the reasons, and the table itself is the desk itself is the conclusion, right? Your conclusion is as good as the legs that support it. So imagine you try to draw a diagram and make sense whether the argument is strong or not, depending on how well these um, premises support the claim. Then also for a bigger argument, you also take into account whether they provide counter arguments, whether they provide omit any information. Then you determine the overall soundness or strength of the argument, um, of your own argument or somebody else's. Okay, so persuasion and propaganda. Again, we're going to have a separate video about all the fallacies put together, but this is just to cover the topic here in this particular unit. Okay, so with the intention to pursue, people use arguments, and you call such arguments a propaganda if they're trying to um, what do you say, send it across masses, and use different kind of symbols to catch your attention, and this is called propaganda. Okay, and propaganda often uses emotional appeals, and there are very fallacies surrounding different kinds of fallacies that you use to make propaganda, and we'll talk about that in the next few slides. And there are some common fallacies people use to do propaganda, and we'll talk about those in the upcoming slides. Okay, so now let's talk about the common argument fallacies. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about some common fallacies, and we're not going to spend too much time. I'm going to just briefly define these, but we'll have some places where we will discuss these in other videos. Okay. So the common fallacies include association effects, right? You might have heard the expression association, guilt by association. So you determine a person to be right or wrong depending on who the person is seen with or associated with. Okay, so you're not arguing based on what the individual says, but based on who the individual associates himself with, right? Ad hominem is attacking the person, not the actual argument. So trying to find faults with the argument, not with the argument, but the person who is making an argument. Remember how you have to analyze the argument just based on the conclusion and whether the reasons support the conclusion, not who is making it, because it is immaterial. Um, and another kind of argument is called the appeal to pity, where you take emotional need as a reason to support the claim, as opposed to the logical connections. Then we have bandwagon, which is a kind of fallacy where you define the success of an individual based on popularity, and not based on the merit. Okay. Then you have testimonials, um, where celebrities uh, endorse a product not because they're an expert to suggest how good of a product it is, but because they are popular and they're making uh, a suggestion that you can be like me if you wear this. So that's a kind of fallacy. False dichotomy, where you only give two choices, although there are multiple choices. So artificially saying this or that, while there are many other options available there. Well, coming to appeal to snobbery, it is the appeal to the status of an individual as opposed to the logic of the argument the person is making. Then card stacking is an interesting fallacy where people intentionally try to hide information and omit presenting information to make their point, right? to persuade you to behave in such a way. They won't give you full information so you can make an informed decision, but they hide the information. That is card stacking. Circular reasoning is you make a conclusion without any reason. In fact, you provide the same conclusion as the reason for the conclusion. You have to eat this food because you have to eat this food. It's like a circular argument. Slippery slope is when the extreme outcomes are described from small steps. Okay? A straw person's argument is when you try to represent others' views in the weakest form. So it's called straw person's argument or layman's argument, where you're taking they're misrepresenting their views or positions and taking the weakest form of it to kind of counteract. False cause, then you have, which is called post hoc, ergo propter hoc. Then you have appeal to tradition, which is the idea that if it has been there for 100 years, then it must be correct. Appeal to authority is relying on the higher authority figure without any reason or without any um, evidence to show their expertise. Okay, so let's move on and talk about how we can change others' beliefs. Okay, so these are more than you trying to use to manipulate others and change beliefs. It is about being aware of how if others are using to change your beliefs. Um, and one way to be really good at arguments is to have an open mind, as we've discussed that in the context of the dispositions necessary for you to be a critical thinker. Now, then you have uh, people try to focus on your weakness, so make sure that you work towards this. And people also try to exploit errors as proof for any errors in the single part of an argument would be considered as a flaw in the entire argument. So you need to be aware of that. Um, Sometimes people use quotes out of context to support their argument. Be aware of that. And sometimes people try to uh, present disagreement as contradiction, which in their view would weaken the argument. Uh, and emphasize the unknown over the known. So make sure that's make a clear distinction between what is known, what is not known when you are in the midst of an argument. Okay, so what's the take home message, the summary? You said that arguments require clear premises and conclusion. We also talked about analyzing the acceptability of the premises and how they support and looking for any information that is missing or might be missing. Then beware of common fallacies and tactics of propaganda and try to cultivate open-minded thinking to make decisions. Well, I hope you liked it. I'll see you in the next video.